Welcome to this interview with Kevin Macnish, author of our new textbook in the Ethics of series, The Ethics of Surveillance. As you state in the book, there's been little consideration of the ethics around surveillance. In a society where we're increasingly under surveillance, are we afraid to ask, is surveillance ethical?
Well, I think that there's been a polarization and a large politicization about what we mean by surveillance. And so to some people, surveillance is always wrong, just as a matter of course. It's something the government does to exploit and oppress and coerce and control people. Whereas for other people, it's a straightforward matter of security. We have surveillance in order to keep ourselves safe, keep ourselves secure, and therefore it's always justified. And I think part of the challenge in asking is surveillance ethical is being able to walk the tightrope between those two positions without falling into one or the other of saying it's always good or it's always bad.
How do we define why surveillance is ethically right? And how do we find our way through the grey areas?
I think that's a really difficult question and a really good one, and that's what I would see as being at the heart of questions about the ethics of surveillance. So I think we can all think of cases where surveillance would clearly be justified. Let's say you have a serial rapist on the loose and the police have a fair degree of evidence as to who this person is. I think we would say they would be remiss in their duty of serving the public if they didn't put this person under surveillance. But on the other hand, we can think of sort of George Orwell's Big Brother or similar dystopian futuristic scenarios where the surveillance is clearly wrong. And the interesting thing for me as a philosopher then is trying to pull apart why some of these cases are right and why some of them are wrong. And numerous people have suggested different reasons, but I think the common elements that most people come down to are firstly having the right reason for surveillance. So for instance, security generally is seen as a good thing. Voyeurism is generally seen as a bad thing. Although if you're talking about the Big Brother game show, then maybe voyeurism isn't necessarily a bad thing. So it's not always straightforward. Proportionality is a second one. Disproportionate surveillance just feels wrong, and we frequently criticize people when it seems like the surveillance has become disproportionate. And thirdly, the idea that surveillance should be discriminating. It should clearly discriminate between people who are in some way liable for surveillance because they have done something or they're suspected of doing something which would justify surveillance, versus people who haven't done anything at all and monitoring them just for the sake of it. So for instance, we see the outcry against mass surveillance conducted by intelligence organizations in recent years that the Edward Snowden revelations brought up. So most people think that that kind of indiscriminate surveillance is wrong as well. So I think those three elements seem to be fairly common to what people think would distinguish justified from unjustified surveillance.
Should surveillance be discriminating? And if so, what does that mean for comparatively indiscriminate surveillance methods such as CCTV in public areas?
Well, definitely, yes, I think surveillance should be discriminating. It just feels wrong to be monitoring somebody if they haven't done anything to justify that monitoring. And if we think that you have a right to go about your normal business without being monitored, then yes, you shouldn't be monitored unless you have unless the surveillant has good reasons for putting you under surveillance. As you say, that then does raise important questions about CCTV in the public square, and I think that is problematic. The standard justification which is often given for CCTV in public is that it can help reduce crime. But the statistics that I've seen all suggest that it actually doesn't work as a deterrent, and that very little crime or criminal activity is prevented by CCTV being there. It can help in detection once a crime has been committed, in finding out who committed the crime and then bringing them to justice. Perhaps most famously, with the 7/7 bombings, we were able to work out who the bombers were remarkably quickly after the event. And so that was helpful for a long-term response to terrorism, but of course it was far too late to prevent the terrorism from occurring. And so I think questions should be raised about the amount of CCTV we have in public. And of course, if we compare the UK with other countries, which I think we're probably one of the most, if not the most, surveyed society in terms of CCTV coverage in the world, other countries that have less CCTV don't have significantly higher crime figures than we do. So it seems to suggest that CCTV is not doing, at least not providing that response to criminal activity that is often given as the prime justification for its installation.
Your new book, The Ethics of Surveillance, the introduction, looks at the ethical issues surrounding the concept of surveillance. How did you approach writing the book?
So I was quite struck when I started researching surveillance from a philosophical perspective how little writing there was on it, on the subject. Historically, there's been, in the last 40, 50 years, there's been a bit written on the ethics of intelligence, which crosses over with surveillance, but the two aren't the same. And so when it came to writing a book on the ethics of surveillance, one of the first things I wanted to do was kind of situate it in the philosophical landscape and say that this is a philosophically interesting position. There is some history to it, so Jeremy Bentham wrote a little bit about the panopticon, suggesting this prison where the prison inmates could be watched by a guard at all times, which Michel Foucault then picked up on in the 70s. And sort of locating what some of the key issues would be. It's not just about privacy, it's about chilling effects, about vulnerability, about security, questions like that, which are all intimately related with surveillance. But then having made that sort of philosophical foundation, I then wanted to move on and talk about the applications and the wide variety. So starting with questions about international espionage and security, but moving on then to also think about welfare, think about retail, industrial espionage, and things like surveillance in schools and surveillance in care homes, and all the number of different areas which surveillance now pervades in our life, literally from cradle to grave.
What's the one thing you think is important to highlight about the issues the book covers?
Probably that surveillance is not a straightforward black and white issue. There's no easy answer to is this good, is this bad, is it the right thing to do, is it the wrong thing to do? And I'm wary of falling into one of those polarized camps of saying surveillance is always good or surveillance is always bad. I think context is crucial, but also thinking critically about the various aspects of the surveillance. Why is it being put into place? Who is putting it there? What are they going to do with it? Those kind of questions all need to be asked in order to question each act of surveillance to see how justified it is within that particular context.